The 1935 document, Malaysians and Australians and the Peopling of America, published by the Smithsonian Institute and written by Alice Acharthy-Leka, shows the early process of reasoning when determining the first peopling in the Americas. The scientific conclusion reached by Alice Acharthy-Leka about the Negro presence in America suggests a bias against Negro peoples. This document also contained blatant academic dishonesty and an overall dismissal of the Black presence in America before Columbus. Alice Acharthy-Leka, Racism and Rise to Power. When viewing this document, it is important to keep in mind the author's point of view on Negro people and the magnitude of influence Acharthy-Leka had on the world of academia. Acharthy-Leka was not born in America, but was a child of immigrants who migrated to America from Austria-Hungary and later moved to New York. He became the director of physical anthropology for expeditions sponsored by the American Museum of Natural History. And in 1910, he became the custodian of physical anthropology collections at the Smithsonian Institute. According to the Smithsonian Institute, quote, Acharthy-Leka was a curator at the United States National Museum, now the National Museum of Natural History, from 1904 to 1941. Acharthy-Leka traveled widely to collect skeletal remains and established the Smithsonian's world-renowned physical anthropology collections. In 1904, he came to head the newly created division of physical anthropology at the National Museum of Natural History, a position he held for the next 40 years, end quote. He also developed the now challenged theory that the first people in America came from Asia across the Bering Strait. What is not readily known about Acharthy-Leka is that he believed in a form of scientific racism called eugenics, which held the belief that poor people and people of color were unfit to live. The Encyclopedia Britannica defines eugenics as, quote, the selection of desired heritable characteristics in order to improve future generations, typically in reference to humans. By World War I, many scientific authorities and political leaders supported eugenics. However, it ultimately failed as a science in the 1930s and 40s, when the assumptions of eugenics became heavily criticized, and the Nazis used eugenics to support the extermination of entire races, end quote. Recently, an article released by the Washington Post titled Bone Rooms, where scientific racists stored their evidence, shows how mainly Black and Native American bones were illegally obtained and experimented upon. Over 30,000 bones now rest in the Smithsonian vaults. According to the article, quote, Bone Rooms tells the story of the worst legacies of colonial anthropology in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The bones of women and men who were loved by their families and might have been honored by them in death became mere objects for study. A central figure in this evolving story is Alice Acharthy-Leka, a Czech-born anthropologist who in 1903 was named the Smithsonian's first curator of physical anthropology. Acharthy-Leka's personality was as acerbic as his ethics were rocky. He essentially encouraged looting of human remains and aligned himself with the eugenics movement, end quote. The praised anthropologist Alice Acharthy-Leka was a blatant racist who practiced scientific misconduct. Early accounts of Black people in America before Columbus, suppressed by Alice Acharti-Leka. From as early as 1607, early explorers held the notion that there were multiple migrations into the Americas. However, these accounts were dismissed by Acharti-Leka. Quote, as early as 1607, early explorers such as Padre Garcia entertained the thought of multiple migrations in the Americas. End quote. Quote, later, advocates of multiple American origins urged the acceptance of the theory that the Polynesians and Malaysians and even Australians participated in the peopling of North and especially South America. End quote. Quote, there are also some early references to Negroes on the American continent. The first to refer to this subject is Peter Martyr, who, writing within 3 years after the discovery of the Pacific by Balboa and using information from letters received from the Isthmus, includes the following unaccredited passage in his third decade. There is a reason not past 2 days' journey distance from Kawaka in which they found only black Moors, and those exceeding fierce and cruel. They suppose that in time past, certain black Moors sailed there out of Ethiopia to rob, and that by shipwreck or some other chance, they were driven to those mountains. The inhabitants of Kawaka lie in continual war and debate with these black men. End quote. In this section, Alice Acharti-Leka presents only 2 accounts about the presence of black people in America before Columbus, yet there were many more accounts by early explorers who saw black people in America. The presence of black people in America was also expressed by Christopher Columbus in his journeys. Moreover, Alice Acharti-Leka says that Peter Martyr's account was unaccredited, yet Director of Native American Studies, Jack D. Forbes, at the University of California, Davis, provides this exact account and plenty more to show evidence of black people in America before Columbus. More suppression of the evidence of black people populating the Americas pre-Columbus were the changing narratives of anthropologists. In 1879, in one of his early reports on the skull found in America, archaeologist Quataphages states that the skull belonged to the Negroid family and suggested that there was a black presence in America. No other group except Negroid was determined to represent the skull, though Quataphages later changed his original narrative. According to Acharti-Leka, quote, in the second volume, however, published in 1889, there are a number of references to Malaysian elements in the New World. On page 308 of this volume, we read, the characteristics of the Lagoa Santa skulls might make us think that the fossil race of Brazil belonged to the Negro type. But in the special memoir which I have devoted to the subject, I have already stated that such an approach should be discarded. In reality, among the present population, there are those that have preserved in a remarkable manner the craniological type of Lagoa Santa and are evidently representatives at times, but very little admixed of this race. But none of these resemble the Negro in the general aspect, in color, in the hair, etc., while a large quantity of evidence shows them all, the external characteristics, to be very close to certain of the yellow races. End quote. In just 10 years, Quataphages changed his narrative, where he stated that the skulls he tested were probably from Oceania or Africa, to stating that there was a small presence of black people in America before Columbus, and the majority of the people belong to the yellow races. The question of why Quatrophagus changed his narrative about the early peopling of the Americas should be investigated. Early peopling of America. Different theories? Anthropologist Ken Tate believes that the majority of the early peopling in America were from the Mongolian race in Asia, whereas, based on the same information, anthropologist Rivet compares the skulls to Negritic or Negro people. Quote, in 1917, Tate still holds that the somatic characteristics of the American Indians taken as a whole are those of the yellow races in general. Also that one finds Americanoid types almost everywhere in Siberia, in the Himalayas, and the neighboring regions in China, Japan, Indonesia, and Polynesia. He believes he can distinguish in America at least 6 principal or primordial and perhaps many secondary races, some of which races, both principal and secondary, inhabit also certain parts of Eastern Asia and Oceania. He makes no point of the occurrence of the seemingly Malaysian-like skulls about La Paz and Lower California, and there is no reference in the paper to Malaysian or other blacks. End quote. Quote, utilizing also data on the small collection of Lower California remains preserved in the United States National Museum at Washington, furnished by HiDDeN. Rivet in 1909 published a handsome report on the materials. He has obtained from the long bones the statues for the males and the characteristics of the available skulls, together with those of the other parts of the skeleton, led him to the following deductions. The Paracus in Lower California differ from the American races in general, and especially from the neighboring Indian populations in the proportions of their body and in certain number of the characteristics of their skeleton, which appear to approximate them to Negritic peoples, without, however, showing a perfect identity with the latter. In 1888, he amplifies this statement thus: today, I restrict myself to declaring that the physiognomic characteristics of the American heads show a divergence so manifest that it is necessary to renounce definitely the conception of a universal and common type of the American Aborigines. They too are a mixture of several original races, and the program of future researches will find its final expression in the separation of the distinct ethnic elements that have entered into the composition of the various living and extinct tribes. End quote. More accounts of early blacks in America. Quote, the year 1888 sees the publication by the Lund Museum of a volume of the Danish studies on the Lagoa Santa remains, and this includes communications on the human bones by Litgen and Hansen. He says, the type of skulls corresponds perfectly to the Papen type, and the bones of the limbs indicate a small or medium stature but robust body, a new resemblance with the Papens. End quote. Quote, in 1923, Mr. Tate, field assistant of the Department of Mammalogy, American Museum of Natural History, found in a ravine near the village of Punan, central Ecuador, a human cranium without the lower jaw. We wish to emphasize that particularly the point that in claiming that this calvarium is Australoid, we have in mind a basic racial relationship and do not believe that it necessarily represents migration from Australia or Malaysia. We feel that unless this is indeed a very remarkable case of parallelism, this type in America and the similar type in Australia and Malaysia are derivations of the same basal racial stock. End quote. Quote, the author, who next to Rivet, takes the most pronounced stance on the subject of the presence of Malaysians in America, is the esteemed veteran of French anthropologist and Rivet's close friend, R. Verneau. In 1922, he receives from a missionary 2 Indian skulls from Colombia. One of these is deformed, but the other, that of a recent Tenebo Indian, who died of a snake bite and whose body was abandoned by his friends, is normal. All in all, Verneau decides, it now appears no longer permissible to doubt the great extension of the Papuan type in the New World. Its traces it was found possible to follow in space from Lower California to the southern extremity of the continent, and from the Atlantic to the Pacific. In time, from the epochs of the race of Lagoa Santa to our day. Verneau admits, it is true, that there are still many gaps in our knowledge on the subject, and that nothing is known as to the mode of the Papuan migration, but those are his only concessions. End quote. Quote, the results indicate, in Lebser's opinion, that the Ona specimen, in many respects, shows a primitive, so to speak, Australoid type, though, of course, the specimen did not belong to a representative of that race. It is on the whole a highly developed type, but one which presents a large number of primitive characters. On the purely morphological grounds of the available material, it does not seem to Lebser very probable that unmixed Australoid had ever been present in South America. End quote. Bias against Black Africa. Scientific conclusions based on the peopling of America has not changed since 1909, and the mention of the ancient skulls belonging to Negro people from Africa has been scarce. Archaeologists such as Walter Nevis and Dr. Goudin have reported that Africans could have possibly been the first people to come to America, yet no extensive research in this particular field known to the public has been done, despite the mounting evidence. Omission of Negro people from ancient America. Quote, so far as known, the supposed Australian and Malaysian blacks have left no sites that could be attributed to them, no recognizable accumulations, no archaeological remains whatsoever in any part of America. They must have forgotten the boats they came in, and even the sea itself, becoming largely land dwellers. There is no trustworthy tradition about them. The evidence appears at first sight so sufficient and so well backed that some serious students, though perhaps they have never had the chance to study the American natives firsthand or to any material extent, feel justified in accepting and even fostering the hypothesis, and that whatever cultural or other resemblance may appear to exist between the pre-Columbian Americas and the South Seas must have other explanations than any material accession of the peoples of the later parts of the world to the American populations. End quote. Final analysis. Though there have been several accounts of Black people in America before Columbus from early explorers, and several anthropologists from Europe and America believe that there were Negro or Black people in America before Columbus, Alice HiDDeN dismisses these narratives and states that there isn't enough evidence to prove that Black people were in America before Columbus, and if they were, they made no significant contribution. Moreover, Alice HiDDeN was a racist and committed horrible atrocities against Black people and Native Americans, and the scariest part of all is that for 40 years, he held a high position in the Smithsonian, which to most academics is one of the most well-respected institutions and trustworthy sources of scientific information. When looking at this document, I noticed most anthropologists mention, as they do presently, that the early Negro skulls could have come from Africa, but focuses only on Negroes outside of Africa. When this document was written, there was no evidence outside of the skull shape suggesting where these Negro skulls could have come from, yet the possibility of Negroes from Africa populating the Americas was conveniently, as they are today, left out of the narrative.